Welcome to the Economist in Your Ear podcast. Today, we're really going to unpack the recent NATO summit in The Hague. You've probably seen the headlines, maybe heard some sound bites, but honestly, there's so much more going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely. We'll be looking at the Economist's take, of course, but also bringing in quite a bit of other information. The aim today is really to get beyond those initial summaries, explore the nuances, maybe challenge some assumptions, and try to grasp what this all means for, well, global security.
Exactly. We're not just giving you a recap. We want to offer a bit more of a critical lens, help you connect the dots, and maybe see what didn't get quite as much attention in the first round of reporting. Okay, so let's start with The Economist's view. Their article, "At a tricky NATO summit, a Trumpian meltdown is averted." It sort of framed it as a close call, didn't it? The main arguments seem to be, one, this Trump management triumph, and two, a historic money pledge. Let's tackle that Trump management piece first. The Economist really focused on Mark Rutte's strategy, particularly with Donald Trump. What exactly was his approach there?
Well, it was pretty remarkable, actually, how deliberate and how public Rutte's strategy was. The article mentioned that text message he sent to Trump, basically praising him, saying, "Donald, you have driven us to a really, really important moment," and adding that Europe is going to pay in a big way, and it will be your win.
And Trump posted a screenshot of that.
He did. He posted it publicly. And then later, Rutte apparently even called Trump daddy in a conversation.
Daddy. Wow. That's quite something for that level of diplomacy.
That certainly raises eyebrows.
Yeah.
But it shows this was very real. The AP, for example, they got hold of that screenshot and verified it. So this wasn't just some rumor. It was a conscious, maybe even theatrical strategy from Rutte to keep the summit on track, avoid a big public blow-up with Trump.
Okay, so that's the Trump angle. Then there's the other big piece, this new money pledge, a target for allies to spend 3.5% of GDP on core defense, plus another 1.5% on related things, infrastructure, cyber, defense industry support, making a combined 5% target.
That's right. And the official Hague Summit Declaration does confirm those exact numbers. 3.5% core defense, and then that additional 1.5% for the other areas. So yeah, that 5% was definitely the big, splashy headline figure coming out of it.
So, surface level.
Yeah.
Crisis averted, big win on spending. But you're suggesting, as we look closer, The Economist might have maybe glossed over some important details. What did they potentially miss? How does that change how we should see this?
Right. This is where it gets interesting. Because the immediate question is, what was the actual price paid to avoid that public drama? The final communique, the official statement, was actually pretty short and, crucially, quite vague.
Vague how?
Yeah. The first key thing is what we call the missing word loophole. If you look closely at the declaration, when it talks about the 5% pledge, it doesn't say all allies commit to it. It just refers to allies generally.
Huh. Just leaving out the word all.
Seems small, doesn't it? But leaving out all makes it politically non-binding. Basically creates this big escape hatch.
An escape hatch. Okay, that sounds more significant than just a missing word. How does that play out in reality? Do we see countries using it?
Oh, absolutely. It's not just theoretical. Look at Spain. Prime Minister Pedro Sanchez came out publicly and said, basically, no. He stated 5% spending would be disproportionate and unnecessary. And importantly, Madrid said it expects no repercussions.
So they just opted out?
Pretty much.
Right.
And Slovakia's Prime Minister, Robert Fico, he said something similar, that his country had other priorities in the coming years than armament. It shows how these opt-outs can spread, become contagious, and how easy it is to exploit that lack of universal commitment when other domestic pressures exist.
Okay, so the 5% headline sounds good, but maybe lacks real teeth. If we're trying to judge NATO's actual readiness, is that 5% even the right number to focus on? What's the real benchmark here?
That's a great question, and it leads to the second key point, the core defense versus headline spending gap. That 3.5% for core defense, that's the actual yardstick.
Why that figure specifically?
Because it's rooted in NATO's own military assessments. It's what their planners figure is needed for the regional defense plans they developed. Right now, only the U.S., Greece, and Poland are actually spending above that 3.5%.
Only 3 countries?
Out of 32 allies, yes. And getting the others there by 2035, which is the time frame mentioned, well, that requires sustained budget growth of maybe 7-8% per year in nominal terms.
That sounds like a lot.
It is, especially for countries like Italy, France, Germany. They're already dealing with high debt-to-GDP ratios over 100%. Pushing defense spending up that much year after year, that's politically brutal. It means tough choices elsewhere. Reuters had a graphic showing 23 allies were below 2.5% in 2024. It just shows the scale of the mountain to climb.
And that deadline, 2035, it feels quite distant, doesn't it? Especially with the current security situation. The Economist kind of brushed off the timeline debate as mere politics. Is it really just politics?
I'd argue it's deeply strategic. And this is our third point. The 2035 versus 2030 deterrence gap. The official declaration might say 2035, but NATO's own planners, they're warning Russia could be in a position to challenge the alliance much sooner, maybe by 2030.
So a 5-year gap.
Potentially. Both Secretary General Root and analysts at the Institute for the Study of War, ISW, they've warned Moscow might rebuild its offensive capability within 5 years after any ceasefire in Ukraine. Lithuania's defense minister, Dovilė Sakalienė, she put it very bluntly, 2035 is after the next war. That mismatch creates a real, potentially dangerous gap in deterrence.
We focused a lot on Europe and the spending pledges, but this summit obviously has wider implications. You mentioned The Economist didn't make much of the Asia-Pacific partners not being there. Leaders from Australia, Japan, South Korea, they'd attended recent summits but skipped this one. Why does that absence matter?
It matters quite a bit, actually. This is our fourth insight. The Indo-Pacific alliance strain. Their no-show, it really signals a discomfort, likely with Trump's very transactional approach to alliances. It also hints at future friction over burden-sharing debates in the Indo-Pacific.
So it wasn't just a scheduling conflict.
Unlikely to be just that, given the context. It points towards potentially bigger geopolitical shifts, how alliances might be stressed not just across the Atlantic, but across the Pacific, too. It shows how interconnected these things are.
And sticking with things perhaps underplayed, President Zelensky, he attended a dinner but was kept out of the main summit meetings. The Economist called this tactical. Was it just tactics, or is there a deeper message there for Ukraine, for the alliance?
It definitely carries a heavier weight.
Uh-huh.
Our fifth point here is about the dilution of deterrence messaging. Okay, maybe it was tactical to manage the room, avoid difficult conversations with Zelensky present, but excluding Kyiv from the core sessions, coupled with a communique that mentions Russia only once.
Only once. Down from how many last year?
Down from 43 mentions in the previous year's document. That's a dramatic drop.
Wow.
It really dilutes the message of deterrence. And it happens just as Moscow is ramping up its defense production. So it sends a potentially ambiguous signal about the alliance's long-term resolve and commitment to Ukraine, both to allies and, crucially, to adversaries.
Okay, so if we pull back from these specific critiques, what are the bigger dynamics here, the things maybe lurking in the background that didn't get enough weight in the initial analysis?
Well, there are several important ones. First, it's not just about money, it's industrial capacity. Europe simply doesn't have the factories right now to produce enough artillery shells, drones, you name it, to actually absorb 5% of GDP effectively and quickly.
So throwing money at it won't solve the problem if you can't build the stuff.
Exactly. The risk is that a spending surge just leads to inflation, higher prices for the same kit, rather than actually delivering more military capability before that potential 2030 threat window. The key takeaway is, money without production capacity is kind of an illusion of strength. Second, and this was hanging over everything, the U.S. election risk. You could feel it. The possibility of a second Trump term was clearly shaping how every leader was thinking and negotiating.
How so?
Well, any pledges made now, however firm they sound, could potentially unravel. If a future U.S. Congress decides Europe is free-riding and cuts support, or, the nightmare scenario, if Trump actually decided to pull the U.S. out of NATO, that uncertainty is huge.
That really does cast a long shadow. What else was maybe underappreciated?
Then there are the hard fiscal ceilings. We touched on this. But for countries like Italy, France, Germany with huge debts, finding the money for sustained real terms defense increases year after year, it means cutting elsewhere.
Cutting social programs.
Education, potentially. Or infrastructure. Or finding new ways to borrow, maybe at the EU level, which opens up a whole other massive political fight. There are real limits to national budgets.
Yeah.
And another thing, quite concerning, is the escalatory optics of certain moves. For instance, Britain announced it's rejoining NATO's nuclear sharing mission. They plan to buy F-35A jets specifically to carry American B-61 nuclear bombs.
Rejoining. They left.
They left that specific mission about 25 years ago. So this is a big shift in the UK's and NATO's nuclear posture.
And the concern there is?
The concern is how Moscow reads that. Proponents will say it's necessary deterrence, but it will almost certainly alarm Russia. And it risks worsening the current situation where arms control agreements have basically collapsed. It could fuel rather than dampen a new arms race. And finally, just quickly, that non-military resilience part of the extra 1.5% spending bucket. It lumps together things like cybersecurity, protecting energy grids, but also industrial subsidies. Without really tight definitions and strong oversight, there's a danger governments could just relabel money they were already spending on, say, infrastructure projects and call it NATO spending.
Creative accounting, essentially.
Exactly. It could allow countries to meet the target on paper without actually making significant new commitments to resilience.
Okay, that's a lot to chew on. Given all this analysis, for you, the listener, what should you actually be watching for? What are the signs over the next few years that tell us if these pledges are turning into real deterrence or if they're just, well, more paper promises?
Right, concrete indicators. Okay, first, through 2026, watch national budgets, particularly Germany, Italy, Spain, a good sign. Seeing a real sustained increase of maybe 0.3 percentage points of their GDP going into defense budgets.
And a bad sign.
Flat spending in nominal terms, or seeing lots of announcements about defense-related infrastructure spending that looks suspiciously like relabeled existing projects.
Second, watch munitions output in Europe. A really positive signal would be hitting a production rate of 2,155mm artillery shells per year by late 2026.
And if they don't?
If production stays stuck under 1 million shells per year, that tells you there's a major bottleneck. The money isn't translating into the actual stuff needed. Third, keep an eye on the language coming out of the U.S. Congress, specifically in the National Defense Authorization Act, the NDAA. A bullish sign for NATO. Congress locking in minimum U.S. troop levels in Europe.
And bearish.
Bills that start talking about conditional Article 5 obligations. That introduces huge uncertainty about the core mutual defense commitment. And finally, watch Russia's own military posture. From NATO's view, a positive sign would be seeing verified proof that Russia is pulling significant forces, like brigade-sized units, out of Ukraine and moving them back to its Western military district.
Meaning they're shifting focus. Potentially, yes. A negative sign would be just continued grinding attrition in Ukraine, with no evidence of a major force rebuild aimed at NATO's borders. That suggests the immediate threat hasn't materialized yet, but the longer-term risk of a rebuilt Russian force remains.
So pulling this all together, what's the bottom line on the Hague summit? Maybe they did dodge a public meltdown with Trump, and okay, in today's world, that's not nothing.
It's not nothing, no. But the price seems to have been a final statement where the headline numbers look much better than the underlying mechanics.
That 5% figure.
Yeah, it masks a lot. The opt-outs for members, the very long deadlines, the potential for that creative accounting we talked about. And most critically, it bumps up against that 5-year window where NATO's own experts think Russia could be strong enough to pose a direct challenge again. There's a real disconnect there.
So ultimately, whether this summit leads to real, stronger deterrence or just ends up being another set of promises on paper, it doesn't really depend on Rute's charm offensive with Trump.
Not really. It depends on parliaments actually voting for the money year after year. It depends on industries actually scaling up production. And it depends on allies choosing not to use those loopholes that countries like Spain have already, well, driven a truck through.
So a final thought for you, the listener. What does this summit really tell us about that tension between political performance, managing personalities, and the hard grind of building actual strategic readiness in a world that feels increasingly dangerous? And maybe how will things like the U.S. election or the simple speed of factory output end up shaping the real legacy of The Hague? Thanks for joining us for this look behind the headlines.